The Praetorian Guard, Chapter 3, Awakenings and Shadows. John drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind lost in a fog of pain and confusion. His body felt weightless, suspended in a strange liquid wall. He tried to open his eyes, but they felt heavy, as though the world itself was pressing down on him, forcing him to stay trapped in the darkness. Slowly, shapes and lights began to filter in through his blurred vision, faint outlines dancing on the edge of his awareness. His senses gradually sharpened, and the pain hit him like a wave. It wasn't the sharp agony he remembered from the interrogation, but a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to resonate through every part of his body. He could feel the tightness in his muscles, the bruises on his skin, and the relentless pounding in his head. John forced his eyes open fully, and the world around him began to take shape. He was floating in a glass tube, surrounded by a strange, bluish liquid. Wires and tubes were attached to his body, connected to various machines that hummed softly in the background. The liquid was warm and comforting, somehow dulling the intensity of his pain, but his mind still reeled with disorientation. Where am I? What happened? John turned his head to the right, and through the faint distortion of the glass, he saw someone sitting just outside the tube. His heart jumped in recognition. It was Lieutenant Igor Vass, the same man who had given him orders at the station in Nova Lux. The last time John had seen him, Vass had been a figure of calm authority. Now, he sat in a chair beside John's regeneration tube, leaning forward with a curious expression. Seeing John's eyes flutter open, Vass smiled. "Well, it's about time," Vass said, his voice carrying that same steady authority. "It's good that you woke up, John. You've been asleep for 3 days. John tried to respond, but his throat was dry, and the words caught in his mouth. His body still felt too weak to move. Panic began to set in. He had so many questions. 3 days. What happened to him? What had they done? Before he could muster any strength to speak, Vass raised a hand, cutting him off gently. "Relax," he said, his tone calming but firm. "There's no need to say anything right now. You're safe. You've been through a lot, but you'll understand everything soon enough." The lieutenant rose from his chair, his boots tapping softly on the floor. He moved with the same precision John remembered from their first meeting, the same efficient confidence. He gave John a final glance, his expression unreadable, before heading for the door. "Rest now," Vass said as he reached the exit. "We'll talk later." With that, the door slid shut behind him, leaving John alone in the softly lit room. The liquid in the glass tube bubbled gently around him, and for a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic beeping of the medical equipment, monitoring his vitals. John blinked, trying to process what had just happened. His mind raced with questions, but there were no answers, just the strange, sterile environment around him. He glanced around as much as his weakened state allowed, noting the hermetically sealed room. There were no windows, only smooth walls, and the space was filled with the latest generation of medical devices. Everything gleamed with a kind of clinical perfection that made John feel even more trapped. What is this place? Why am I here? His thoughts kept returning to the interrogation. The pain. The questions. He had endured it for 3 long days. 3 days of brutal torture at the hands of his captors, and he had told them nothing. But how had he escaped? And why was Vass, the lieutenant who had given him his original orders, now sitting by his side, as though this was all part of some twisted plan? John's head throbbed, and he closed his eyes, trying to calm the storm of thoughts. He didn't have the strength to unravel the mystery now. The best thing he could do was wait for his body to heal, wait for answers. But the uneasy feeling in his chest told him that the truth, whatever it was, wouldn't be something simple. 10 minutes passed, the silence of the room broken only by the soft hum of machinery. John began to settle into the rhythm of the medical equipment, his mind wandering aimlessly as he floated in the regeneration fluid. But then, the door to the room slid open again. John's heart rate spiked as he strained to see who had entered. A figure stepped into the room, moving with a confident grace. She was tall, dressed in a sleek black jumpsuit that hugged her form, but with no insignia or identification. Her steps were silent, precise. She moved with a poise and calm that immediately set John on edge. "Hi, John," she said, her voice smooth and casual, as though they were old friends. "I hope you're feeling better." John's body went cold. His mind snapped back to the interrogation room, the memory crashing into him like a tidal wave. That voice. It was the same voice that had haunted him for 3 days. The same voice that had questioned him endlessly, beaten him, tortured him, and tried to break him. His muscles tensed, his breath catching in his throat. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to fight, to escape. But he was powerless, trapped in a glass tube, his body too weak to even move. The woman noticed his reaction and smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent chills down John's spine. She moved closer to the tube, her eyes never leaving his, as she studied him with predatory calm. "Oh, you remember me, don't you?" she asked, her voice light and teasing. "Good. I was hoping you would." John's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at her, unable to respond, unable to move. His mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of the situation. How was she here? Why was she acting like they were on the same side? She took a step closer, placing her hand on the glass of the regeneration tube. Her fingers splayed out as though she could reach through and touch him. Her eyes glittered with amusement as she watched him struggle. "You didn't say a word," she said softly, almost as though she admired him. 3 days of questioning, and not a single word. Impressive. But don't worry, this time I won't be asking you any question." John's pulse quickened, his body still frozen in shock as she moved around the tube, her footsteps echoing softly in the small room. She circled him like a predator, toying with him, savoring his helplessness. "Relax," she said, her voice still calm, still soft. "You're not my enemy. Not anymore. In fact," she paused, smiling again, "you're exactly where you're supposed to be. You rest and recover, we'll talk later." With that she turns to the door and leaves. The days passed in a haze of silence and recovery. John floated in the regeneration tube, his body healing from the brutal torture he had endured. The medical equipment hummed softly, monitoring his progress as his wounds slowly faded. The pain had dulled into an echo of what it once was, and his mind, though still burdened with questions, had grown accustomed to the strange limbo he found himself in. The woman, Sarah, her voice still haunted his thoughts. She had appeared at his bedside with that knowing smile, the same voice that had interrogated him for 3 days in a nightmare of pain and disorientation. She had said something that still gnawed at his consciousness, something that didn't make sense. It was all just a test. A test? John tried to make sense of it. Who would subject someone to 3 days of torture as a mere test? And for what purpose? The thought lingered in his mind as he waited, his body mending in the strange, warm liquid. For now, he had no choice but to trust that, soon enough, the answers would come. On the 6th day, the hum of the machine slowed, signaling that his body had fully recovered. John stirred, feeling strength return to his muscles. The aches had faded, his bruises all but vanished. He felt more alive than he had since before the abduction, but his mind remained alert, wary of what would come next. As if on cue, the door to the room slid open with a soft hiss. John turned his head, and there she was, Sarah. She stepped inside with the same confident grace, her black jumpsuit pristine, her expression unreadable. For a moment, they stood there in silence, her eyes scanning the machines before landing on him. "It's time, John," she said, her voice calm and soothing. "You're ready." With a slight nod, she moved to the control panel beside the regeneration tube, pressing a few buttons. The liquid began to drain, and John felt the weight of his own body return as the warmth of the tube's fluids receded. His limbs were still stiff from the long recovery, but his strength had returned. The glass lifted, and Sarah stepped forward to help him out of the tube. Her touch was firm, but gentle as she guided him onto his feet. For a moment John swayed, The feeling of solid ground beneath him, foreign after so many days submerged in liquid. But he steadied himself, his instincts kicking in, his mind adjusting to his new state. "Here," Sarah said, handing him a black jumpsuit identical to hers. "Put this on." John took the jumpsuit and dressed in silence, his mind racing with questions. But he held them back. Now wasn't the time. He needed to understand more before he could confront her with the avalanche of confusion building in his mind. Once dressed, he stood before Sarah, who gave him a brief nod of approval. "Follow me," she said, motioning toward the door. Without hesitation, John followed. The two of them left the sterile, windowless room and stepped into a narrow corridor that stretched on in both directions. The walls were smooth, metallic, and featureless, the lighting dim. There were no windows, no signs of where they were. It could have been underground or deep within some fortified building. The atmosphere was thick with secrecy. Sarah moved silently, her footsteps barely making a sound as they walked down the corridor. John followed close behind, his eyes scanning his surroundings. The corridor seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in ways that made it impossible to get a sense of direction. It was as if they were walking through a maze with no end in sight. Finally, they stopped in front of a large, featureless door. Sarah pressed her hand to a panel beside it, and with a soft click, the door slid open. She stepped inside, motioning for John to follow. He hesitated for a brief moment, but then walked through the doorway. The room was starkly different from the rest of the facility. It was large and minimally furnished, with a single desk in the center and two chairs facing each other. The walls were made of the same smooth metallic material as the corridor, but here there was an air of purpose. This room wasn't just a part of the facility. It was where decisions were made, where things happened. There were no windows, no decorations, only the faint hum of hidden machinery that seemed to pulse beneath the surface. Sarah gestured for John to sit. "Have a seat," she said, her voice now carrying a slight edge of formality. John moved cautiously to the chair and sat down, his eyes locked on her as she made her way to the other side of the desk. She sat opposite him, leaning forward slightly, her hands folded on the surface between them. For a moment, she studied him, her gaze cool and assessing. Then she extended her hand, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Welcome, John," she said softly. "Welcome to the Shadows of the Night." John's heart skipped a beat. Shadows of the Night. He had never heard the name before, but something about it sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't some ordinary military unit, and whatever he had been dragged into, it was far more complex and dangerous than he had imagined. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving his. "Everything you've been through, from your time at the academy to your recent experiences," she said, her voice calm and measured, "was all part of a test, a way to see if you were ready for something greater." John frowned, his mind racing to piece together what she was saying. "A test? You tortured me for 3 days, nearly broke me," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. "And that was a test?" Sarah's expression softened, but the calm, calculating edge never left her eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "We all went through it. Every member of the Shadows of the Night. It's not just physical endurance, John. It's about trust, resilience, and the ability to withstand the most extreme situations. You had to prove you were capable of surviving under the most brutal conditions without breaking, without revealing anything." John's mind swirled with the weight of her words. A test, a sick, twisted trial. And somehow he had passed. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "This isn't just another unit, John. The Shadows of the Night are different. We operate in the places no one else can. The shadows behind the curtains, the hands that steer the course of the Dominion from the darkness. We don't exist on the official records. We are the invisible force that protects the Dominion from threats both known and unseen." John sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. It was too much to process at once. Torture, secrecy, and now an invitation into some covert organization that operated outside the bounds of anything he had ever known.
"Why me?"
he finally asked, his voice low.
"Because you survived,"
Sarah replied.
"You didn't break. You're stronger than most, and that's exactly what we need."
The room fell into a heavy silence. Sarah's eyes locked on his. John stared back at her, still trying to grasp the enormity of what she was telling him. This was a new life, a new path. And the darkness he was being asked to step into seemed deeper than anything he had ever faced.